I regret that I didn't look into the technological, what they've done technologically to try to battle this, how they've used AI to try to help. I know that's the title of the class. I went down a couple rabbit holes politically and policy wise, and then before I knew it, time was up. So, but I'm trying to motivate this discussion to get some interesting ideas that we can kind of talk about. And I'd like to see a little bit of pushback and some questions that result from this. So here we have New York, the concrete jungle where dreams are made of. And I'd like to just give you a little visual of just the impact. So this is before, after. So this is Corona. We're talking about New York City, this place that has so many people going one way. Never heard less English in New York City. More people going back and forth doing things. All gone. Literally these little things of, you know, in those Western movies, those things that roll across the desert, that's what we're seeing now. So I'd like to get into it by the policy decisions that I saw. I would characterize them more as reactionary policy. You know, New York doesn't really have, it can't say that, you know, we hadn't seen this before because they've seen what was happening in China. They've seen what was happening in Italy. They've seen what was happening in Washington. That is not an out that you can choose. So we get the first case in New York on March 1st. I think it was some woman from Iran. Going off memory here, so they might not be perfect, but so what Cuomo says a week later after this first case. So now it is the 3rd of March and there is 142 cases. And he's just like, don't let fear outstrip the facts, which is a really logical thing to say. And what this is it's just like a political cartoon of this guy who's a king who looks like he's not really doing much and things are falling over all around his head. That's kind of how I interpret the New York story. So now we get to the 10th of March and all of a sudden, instead of, you know, don't let fear outstrip the facts, Cuomo says, contain the virus, contain it. We have a cluster in this area called New Rochelle, not to be confused with New Rochester. And so Cuomo says, within a mile radius of this it was actually 108 people that were in this area, we're going to just contain it. We're not going to let the virus out. We got this, guys. So basically, 3 days passed. Now we're at the 13th. We're at 412 corona cases. I think the administration has realized that the containment of New Rochelle didn't work. And now the virus is spreading. So we say, okay, well, we're not going to have large gatherings of people. Anything over 500 people, we're not going to allow. So next thing that happens, boom, 4 days later, now cases are up to 1,374 cases. Crowd capacity can only be limited to 50 people. Good things are taken away from the people. No more casinos, no more gyms, no more restaurants, no more bars, only takeout for restaurants. But still, we see reactionary policy now. So we're freezing the debt that was owed to the people. Bills go out for job protection, signed into it. Business are lowered down to 50% occupancy. We're only talking, guys, this is all happening in a week, right? So this guy is having daily updates on the virus, making policies as they come. So then we get to a day later, and now we get to an interesting thing of, hey, if you're non-essential, stay home. We come into this interesting thing. What does it mean to be essential and non-essential? Can you tell your hairdresser, hey, you're not essential anymore. You're not an essential employee. What kind of message is that spreading? How should it have been spread? Should people's feelings have been taken more into consideration? So
Kurt, you only have 5 minutes left. Get to August 1st.
Okay, so who here has heard the boy cried wolf? Has anyone heard this story? Okay, so the boy cried wolf, basically the shepherd boy takes care of the sheep. He's like, there's a wolf, there's not a wolf. Cuomo cries wolf. He's like, we need gowns, we need masks, we need gloves, 4 hospitals, 30,000 ventilators. Helperize 7 days later. They send in this US naval ship, which is basically a hospital on the sea. They get the Army to make them 4 hospitals, but hardly any of them get used. Hardly any of them get used. And so the president kind of gets at him because Cuomo's just sitting there asking for help. He gives him help and he doesn't even use the resources. And I want to talk about the financial realities of when you run shortage and surplus markets. This is the main thing. This is the main thing. We're at August 1st, basically, as far as I'm concerned. You know, before there's a shortage of supplies, because he's like, hey, don't let fear outstrip the facts, right? So we're a shortage. We should have been supplying. All of a sudden, we hit the peak, and now he's like, we need more stuff. By the time the stuff gets here, we don't need it anymore. And these are financial realities. The state's out of money. We were running a $10 to $15 billion deficit as of April. The economy is not likely to make up the difference. Whose monies does this come out of? How are we going to do this? These are all questions that we need to answer. Going into some, so why I think though that this happened, the financial realities, is when people are estimating the stuff, they're not taking into account the fact of the life cycle of a virus. Each time it's passed, transmitted from person to person, that person's immune system battles the virus, it weakens it. So that person, 10 viruses away from the person that had the version of the virus that did cause them to see the hospital, now they get a version that they hardly even know that's there. Now they get a version where ages 20 to 39, people living in Washington make up 40% of the people carrying the virus because they don't even know that they have it because they have a weaker strain. I'm not sure if that was exactly what you said, but it might have been. So
Kurt, you have 2 minutes left. We want to have some time for questions as well.
Okay. Okay, well, so I won't go about the opinions to reopen then, because that's a whole nother thing, but I really believe it hinges upon people's belief systems in the afterlife. I think that if you believe that this life is it, then yes, death is maybe the worst thing that can happen, and Cuomo's arguments for saying nothing is worse than death, okay, maybe. But for a lot of people, they don't really believe that. And if you don't believe that, then having your liberties taken away is like worse than that, if that makes sense. So interesting facts. Tiger in the Bronx has COVID. Interesting. Cuomo unveils a mural made of masks donated to New York from out of state. Looks like he really needed them. Acts of kindness. Let's finish off with acts of kindness. The Chinese come in big. They donate 1,000 ventilators, 1 million masks, NBA 1 million masks. This one I really like. Islamic Center of the Capital District donates $20,000 for COVID-19 relief raised by area mosques. You have people, you know, being very stingy in economic hardship, and here you see a community going above and beyond. I thought that was really touching. Of course, hindsight's 2020, but I'd like to hear what you guys have to say. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Kurt. Let's do a virtual clap for Kurt. I mean, let's also find out some of the objective information about the density as well as the hub. Like if anything were to happen in the United States, you know, the first location would be in New York. So there is also reality there. Any question for New York or Kurt? And we have lived through this, so we know this information really well.
I have a question. So you said that all the help that the Army provided and the new hospitals that were made, most of them were not used. But like from what I remember, there was a time when New York was getting like 14,000 new cases every day, right? So how is that possible?
Like, how can you possibly, like, you're predicting that you need the hospitals. You order the government comes in and tries to help. I believe the argument I said about the life cycle of the virus is the main player here. and that's what makes it so hard to estimate. If there was places where needed, Cuomo would have looked like a hero, the army would have looked like heroes, it could have happened. I'm not saying that's not possible.
Okay, gotcha.
I'm saying it turned out that a lot of it did not get used, which is unfortunate.
I think at that time, the models that were predicting the virus spread, they were not very accurate because they don't have enough data. And the virus has multiple different strains. Who knows how strong they could be. So that's why I think Cuomo was overly protective, and that's why he suggested more and more PPE and masks. I think that's
That's a
what
great point.
happened. Yeah.
And like, if you can't really blame him for preparing for the worst, you know, like if he didn't do that and it ended up being the worst, then I'm sure he would have got a lot more ridicule.
Right.
I think we're not going to agree on how well of a job Cuomo has done because people have opinions. But let's focus on the information that we know, that it was really bad in New York State, but we have done a good job to get to where we are compared to other states. So why did that happen? What did New York do really well for it to contain really effectively? So what is the answer?
One other interesting thing about New York, that I've thought about is, I'm wondering if you'd agree that sort of federal policy kind of impacted New York differently, because you think about Washington and California, a lot of international travel comes from Asia versus New York. A lot of it comes from Europe, and I think flights from China were cut off well before flights from Europe. And so you just had so much more time for the virus to kind of come into the country too. I don't know if you
that's a good point.
agree with that or disagree.
I think that this quote at the end addresses what you're talking about. Like an outbreak anywhere effectively means an outbreak everywhere. And they should have probably shut down flights to Europe as well at that time to be on the safe side. And maybe that's a takeaway from this experience for future pandemics.